When Elizabeth Tudor ascends the throne in 1558, her regime is dangerously fragile. She is a Protestant queen, ruling a country that is still, in its instincts and in its traditions, deeply Catholic. Yet she survives on the throne. Surrounded by enemies, though she is, there is no rebellion, there is no invasion. But this is not a peace. Protestant England is in a Cold War. Europe has become a deadly chessboard. Potential traitors are everywhere. This episode is brought to you by the Lloyds 5K house deposit, and this is something that was last seen in 1996.
Yeah, so the 1990s looks now like a lost golden age of prosperity and positivity, doesn't it? Think of the advent of the Blair administration in 1997, all the enthusiasm and excitement that surrounded that, the economic growth of the time, the technological developments, the sort of sense of an endless golden summer where everybody's listening to Blair and Oasis and looking forward to buying their first houses. And that, of course, takes us to mortgages. Now, the good news is that in a nod to the 1990s, Lloyds are offering 5K deposit mortgages to first-time buyers. So search 5K first-time buyer.
1996 average first-time buyer deposits are based on ONS data. Subject to status, your home may be repossessed if you don't keep up repayments, and conditions apply.
Let's start with our protagonist. This is William Cecil. He is the Principal Secretary of State to Queen Elizabeth I, and he is unquestionably the most powerful man in England at this point, isn't he?
He absolutely is. So we have met him before in the series we did on the young Elizabeth, but those who haven't listened to that, who've forgotten it, just to remind ourselves who he is, what he's lived through, what he's about. So he's from a relatively humble background of Welsh extraction, so a little bit of Welsh history again.
Great to have some Welsh history.
Yeah, of course. He's from Lincolnshire. He's a very committed Protestant, but even more than that, the thing about him is he's unbelievably alien. I would say perhaps the ablest minister in the whole of British history. And as you said, under Elizabeth I, he's definitely the most powerful figure in the kingdom. And that is because he has all kinds of qualities. He's very loyal. He's very subtle. He has an insane capacity for hard work. And basically, he's the master of all the arts of statecraft. And he's also very experienced. So in 1569, he is 49 years old. And by this point, he has served 3 Tudor monarchs in succession. And these are the 3 children of Henry VIII. The son was Edward VI, and he had come to the throne as a young boy in 1547. I mean, very young. But he was a very ardent Protestant. You know, if there were kind of churches to be painted white and rood screens to be smashed, he'd be piling in.
He loved a whitewash.
He loved a whitewash. And this is great for Cecil, who, as we said, is an ardent Protestant. So to be very able and to be an ardent Protestant under Edward VI was great. And so Cecil, you know, the Tudor board of snakes and ladders, he is shooting up those ladders under Edward VI. But then in 1553, total disaster for Cecil because Edward dies at the very tender age of 15, and he is succeeded by his elder sister, Mary. And when I say elder, I mean she's really elder because she's 37 at that point. And she is the daughter of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who is both very Catholic and very Spanish. And Mary has inherited a fondness for Catholicism and the Spanish that will result in England kind of doing a massive reverse turn from Edward's Protestant settlement. So Mary returns England to papal obedience. She marries a very, very Catholic husband. And this is Philip of Spain, who is the heir to an enormous empire. So not just Spain itself, but the Low Countries, huge chunks of Italy, great swathes of the New World. So all those lands that the conquistadors have conquered.
But what about Cecil during this period? Because presumably he, as an ultra-Protestant, this is not good for him.
Yeah, well, so we said he's subtle. I mean, his subtlety at this point consists very much in keeping his head down, but also kind of looking around and thinking, well, what if Mary doesn't survive? What if she doesn't have a child, which she ends up not doing? Who will then the heir be? And the answer is it will be this very Protestant half-sister of Mary called Elizabeth. And Mary hates and fears Elizabeth for reasons that go a very long way back, because we said Catherine of Aragon, this Catholic Spanish princess who is Mary's mother, Henry's first wife, had notoriously been divorced and dumped by Henry VIII in favour of Anne Boleyn, who was Protestant. And Anne Boleyn was Elizabeth's mother. So as Elizabeth grows up, Mary's supporters and Catholics more generally see Elizabeth as this kind of bastard daughter of a heretic, a witch, a whore, this woman who had been executed in the Tower of London. And so Elizabeth is the great kind of bogey for Catholics, but that of course makes her the great prospect, the great heroine for Protestants like Cecil. For large stretches of Mary's reign, Elizabeth is kept pretty isolated, either actually in the Tower for several months or kind of in the depths of the countryside. But Cecil, he is kind of putting out feelers to Elizabeth and kind of serving really as her kind of right-hand man, her teacher, her instructor in the arts of statecraft.
Her consigliere.
Yes. And so by 1558, it is becoming clear that not only is Mary not going to have a child, but that she is dying.
So then on the 17th of November, 1558, the long-awaited moment comes. Mary does die. Elizabeth becomes queen. She's 25 years old. And as everybody expects, her new chief secretary is William Cecil. And his priority is to have a new U-turn after Mary's U-turn, to turn back to what he regards as the true faith and to lead England into the sunlit uplands of Protestantism. And he has a fair bit of leeway to do this because Elizabeth basically is placing a colossal amount of trust in him. I mean, he's got a lot of power, hasn't he?
Yeah, so Elizabeth says to him, I want you as minister to do what you think is right for me in the country, even if I may not necessarily agree with you. So that is an incredible degree of trust. The kind of contrast with her father, of course, who was very prone to chopping the heads off ministers with whom he ended up disagreeing. Elizabeth is saying, I won't do this. And she stays true to that word.
Do you think she does that partly because she's a woman? Do you think she feels that she needs a reliable, stable chief minister? She can't go through them as her father did.
I think that's part of it. But I think it's more the case that Elizabeth has a very, very astute eye for talent, and she can recognize what she has in Cecil. And maybe the measure of that is that normally a king or queen is served by various secretaries, but Cecil is her only secretary. And effectively, I said he's the ablest man in the history of English government. I mean, he's definitely the most tireless. So to quote Stephen Orford, who's written the definitive biography of Cecil, by design and by instinct, he was at the heart of Elizabeth's court. He controlled the machinery of power. He ran the royal secretariat and chaired meetings of the Privy Council. He advised the Queen daily and read every piece of paper that was sent to her. He was Elizabeth's voice to the world, for he wrote her letters and proclamations and drafted the instructions to her ambassadors. With ready access to her in her private rooms and a mastery of the government machine, he saw and heard all that went on at court. So he has a finger in every pie going.
So some people might be reminded of, especially people who've read Wolf Hall and the successor books, might be reminded of Thomas Cromwell, who was another very mighty chief minister. But I suppose the difference is that Thomas Cromwell, who was Henry VIII's chief minister, was a bit of a blunt instrument, wasn't he? Whereas Cecil operates more cleverly in the shadows. He's smoother, I suppose.
I think also Cromwell was loyal to Henry, but not sufficiently loyal in the end. Whereas Cecil is always loyal. And even when he is going against what seems to be Elizabeth's wishes, Elizabeth is confident that he is ultimately serving her purposes and her cause. And she never doubts that. And I think she's right not to doubt that. And the reason that Cecil is loyal to Elizabeth isn't just a personal loyalty. It's a conviction that God has placed her on the throne to serve as a kind of a Deborah, a judge sent to rule God's chosen people and to help kind of bring them out of the bondage of popery and superstition. But also what steels him in his sense of mission, I think, is a sense that within England, Protestants are surrounded by enemies, and that within Europe, England is surrounded by enemies, and that these enemies are working to destroy England's path to godliness, and that therefore although it may not be an open war, it is a cold war in which falsehood is attempting to overthrow truth, and hell is raging against the forces of heaven, and Satan against Christ. And I think that unless you accept that this is fundamental to Cecil's vision and purpose, you don't really understand what is at stake in Elizabethan England in this period. It is fundamental to the way that Cecil sees the world.
So he's simultaneously a man of subtlety and nuance, but also a man who, at his heart, believes this is ultimately a straightforward clash between right and wrong, truth and lies, the way of heaven and the way of hell, I guess. So we started and we were 10 years on, effectively, for more than a decade on from Elizabeth's coronation. And when Cecil wrote that briefing paper, I mean, he doesn't say, well, 10 years on and everything is great. He actually, there is a sense of sort of existential urgency to his briefing, because he thinks that Elizabeth is more embattled than ever before. And this comes back to the issue of her great rival, doesn't it, Mary, Queen of Scots?
I mean, if you read that briefing paper, which is very detailed and fascinating, he doesn't quite put it in these terms, but essentially, Cecil sees all of England's problems as stemming from two women. And the first of these two women is actually the Queen herself, Cecil's royal mistress, Elizabeth Tudor. We've said Cecil is devoted to her, but he also finds her completely infuriating. He finds her willful, mercurial, obstinate in all kinds of matters in which he thinks she should not be obstinate. And her absolute worst mistake, in Cecil's opinion, is to cling to a policy that she is held to right from her coronation. And Cecil describes it as being her coldness and forbearing from the beginning of her reign to proceed in marriage.
Just to play devil's advocate, she has refused to marry for actually very good reasons. And we talked about them in our previous series about the young Elizabeth. Because once you marry, you hand over your autonomy and your power, don't you, as a queen? And you hand all of that over to your husband, and she just doesn't want to make that mistake.
Well, there's the example of Mary Tudor, who had married Philip of Spain, and lots of Englishmen, not necessarily Protestants, felt that this had subordinated England to Spain's interests, and Elizabeth doesn't want to repeat that mistake. And as you say, she absolutely has very good politic reasons for remaining a virgin. And in a way, it's amazing that Cecil can't see this.
Yeah.
And also, I think what's surprising, considering how astute Cecil is, that he doesn't recognize how brilliant a diplomatic weapon it is, that Elizabeth's virginity means that she has something to offer all kinds of people, and she can play them along and, play hard to get and kind of dangle the prospect of kind of teaming up with a suitor. And it enables her to play France and Spain off against each other.
But to play devil's advocate on the other side, Cecil actually has a good point about not marrying. Because, of course, this is a very high-risk strategy. This is an age when, you can get flu or you can get dysentery or whatever, and that's it, you're gone. And if she dies, everything that he's building will have been for nothing.
And you said, Elizabeth might fall ill. So in 1562, she caught smallpox and very nearly died of it. And of course, Cecil and all Elizabeth's ministers are agonizingly aware of the fact that there are foreign agents and there are domestic traitors out there who know that all they have to do is slip her some poison or, take out a dagger or even a pistol. This is an era where assassins are starting to think, well, we could shoot a head of state. So the jeopardy is enormous. And again, I think this is something that listeners have to bear in mind. We know that Elizabeth survives to a ripe old age. She has this incredibly lengthy reign, but that jeopardy is there throughout the reign, and particularly in this period. Elizabeth is very vulnerable, and that means that Protestant England is very vulnerable, because if Elizabeth dies or is killed, then from Cecil's perspective, this will spell the triumph of Antichrist, because Elizabeth's obvious heir, as we've said, is the second woman to haunt his nightmares, and this is Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots.
So we did a whole series about Mary, Queen of Scots last year, didn't we? And we talked in that series. She's Elizabeth's cousin. She has Tudor blood in her veins. So she's not just a Stuart, she has Tudor blood. She is a Catholic, and she's actually one of the worst kinds of Catholics you can find because she's
a French Catholic, basically.
So her mother was from the great Catholic aristocratic dynasty, the Guise dynasty.
Yeah.
But she'd also been brought up effectively as a French woman, as a French princess, and she had briefly been the Queen of France.
Yes. So I don't think any patriotic Englishman wants a queen like that on the throne. And not least because you mentioned the Guise. So the Guise, I mean, they're not just the most powerful aristocratic dynasty in France. As we will be seeing in the second half, they are militantly Catholic. And so therefore massive dangers and threats to English Protestantism. So they are really worth bearing in mind that Mary is very closely linked to them. The chief of the Guise was her uncle. This is really bad news for English Protestants. On top of that, they see her as a morally evil person, as someone who is supposed to have killed her own husband, Lord Darnley, who listeners may remember was described as the great cockchick, kind of terrible man. We actually concluded that Mary probably didn't kill him, but there was a kind of insane murder plot that involved explosions and people being found in gardens and chairs and all kinds of mad stuff. But definitely in Scotland as well as in England, people do think that Mary was responsible for killing her husband. And in summer 1567, the Protestant establishment in Scotland had decided that they'd had enough and they'd risen in rebellion. They defeated Mary in battle. They'd imprisoned her on an island on a lonely loch, and they had forced her to abdicate. Now, Mary is kind of irrepressible. She's always bouncing back from seemingly total disaster. And on the 2nd of May, 1568, she'd managed to escape from this kind of keep on this lonely island, and she set about trying to win her throne. But the attempt had been a disaster. She'd lost a battle. And so she had decided, what can I do now? The only thing I can really do is to go to England and ask my cousin Elizabeth for help. And so on the 16th of May, she had left Scotland forever from this very romantic spot below Dundrennan Abbey in Galway, very eerie place. I went and visited it at the New Year. And she gets into a fishing boat and she rows across the Solway Firth to Cumbria in England, Westmoreland as it was. And she steps foot onto English soil and she immediately writes first to Elizabeth to explain, what she's hoping for. And then madly to Cecil. And she said, I have the hope of obtaining the assistance of your good counsel. And that is mad because, of course, Cecil is her deadliest enemy. Cecil hates her. In fact, he wants her dead. Let's be absolutely blunt. That is Cecil's endgame. He wants her removed from the chessboard. While Mary had been Queen of Scots on the throne in Scotland, this Catholic, this Guise, this essentially French woman, she had been haunting Cecil's nightmares. Now she's come to England. She is still a threat, but at least she is now kind of under lock and key because Cecil does not allow Elizabeth to help her. And in fact, Elizabeth is happy not to help her. So instead, she's placed under this kind of house arrest. And Cecil is hoping that Elizabeth can be persuaded to license her execution. But there is a problem because although Elizabeth has no fondness for Mary, and although she entirely recognises the danger that Mary as a Catholic represents to the future of Protestant England, the salient thing from Elizabeth's point of view, even more important than Mary's Catholicism, is the fact that she is an anointed monarch. And you cannot, from Elizabeth's point of view, simply chop off the head of an anointed monarch, because Elizabeth herself is an anointed monarch, and she does not want to be the queen who established the precedent that said it was okay to execute an anointed ruler.
This is the problem. This is the dilemma that is confronting Elizabeth and Cecil. What are they going to do with Mary, Queen of Scots, and how are they possibly going to bolster this Protestant regime? We will find out after the break. This episode is brought to you by National Geographic. Tom, we're familiar, aren't we, with what happened in Pompeii when Vesuvius exploded?
We absolutely are. So AD 79, Vesuvius blows its top. Debris rains down on Pompeii. It ends with a pyroclastic flow, which essentially entombs the city, entombs everyone left living there. And it lay there waiting to be brought to light centuries and centuries later.
Now, in Pompeii Out of Time with Tom Hiddleston, Hiddleston will guide you between past and present. He will uncover the real stories of the people who lived through one of history's most notorious disasters.
It is a cinematic masterpiece from the makers of Loki, and it brings the ancient world vividly to life.
Watch Pompeii Out of Time with Tom Hiddleston, Thursday at 8 p.m. on National Geographic. Welcome back to The Rest is History. So, we are in the autumn of 1569, and we are in Westminster on the Strand. Specifically, we are in Cecil House. So this is the family home of the man we were talking about in the first half, William Cecil, the chief minister of Elizabeth I. But this is also the headquarters, the nerve centre of his entire operation. So the house has just been finished. Cecil helped design it. It's got orchards. It's got nice symmetrical gardens. It's got a kind of tennis court. It's got a bowling alley. He's got his study looking out over the garden where he can look out and he can contemplate his schemes. His study is full of books and coins and antiquities and things. And in this world, he is contemplating the problems of protecting his patron, Elizabeth I, and ensuring the survival of her regime at the apex of Protestant England. Because when he looks out at the world, Tom, he sees it as we see Elizabethan England as this kind of, golden world of people slapping their thighs and exchanging Shakespearean banter. But he sees it as a world of danger and plots and traitors and conspiracies, doesn't he?
So we've talked about how there are kind of echoes of contemporary spy thrillers in this 16th century story. And people who've seen Slow Horses, the name comes from Slough House, which is this kind of terrible metaphor for the state of Britain, crumbling, decayed, decrepit place where failed spies live. I think that Cecil House has a similar metaphorical quality, but it is much more impressive. So you've described how it's exquisite, it's beautiful, it's ordered, and it's this great nerve center in which Cecil's mighty political brain is kind of pulsing like a beacon. But beyond the walls, the very thick walls of Cecil House, you have seething alleyways, you have kind of squalid tenement blocks. They're rife with violence, heavy with plague. And then, of course, beyond them, as you said, there are even more dangers. So that sense of Cecil's world as a kind of still centre from which he can try to dampen down all the dangers and the perils that are threatening Protestant England. I think it's a kind of very powerful sense. I think he had it. I think that's why it mattered to him that Cecil House was a place of order. It's a counterpoint to the chaos that he feels that he is combating. And, there is no question what the greatest danger facing England is as Cecil sees it. So in the short memorial of the state of the realm, which you began the episode with a reading from, he'd drawn up all these kind of dangers, but he said that ultimately they all go back to the one poisonous focus, and that is Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart. And he sums it up: the exalting of the Queen of Scots shall please the Pope, the two monarchies of France and Spain, and all the papists in Christendom, England, and Scotland. So there are enemies everywhere. And so listeners may be wondering, well, is he right about this? Is there actually a vast conspiracy that embraces Catholics in England and Scotland, the kind of enemy within you might want to call, but also Philip II of Spain, the King of France, and the Pope? And if there is a conspiracy, is its aim to topple Queen Elizabeth? And are the conspirators looking to replace Elizabeth with Mary, Queen of Scots? So is Mary Stuart really the danger that Cecil thinks that she is?
Well, let's start with England. England itself. I mean, you said, people think of it as maypoles and all of this kind of thing, Elizabethan England. But actually, when Cecil looks, if you can picture him kind of looking at his map or at his dashboard or something, the lights are flashing red. There are enemies everywhere on the map. And there's good reason for that, because England has been a very troubled place in 1569.
Well, more specifically, there's been this terrifying warning that no one can ignore, which is the fact that a servant woman in Leicestershire had given birth to a cat. And everyone has agreed that, oh God, well, here we go.
Yeah.
This is very bad. And sure enough, on the 6th of September, 1569, a massive crisis does break out. And it's incredibly dangerous because it embroils England's most powerful nobleman. And this is the Duke of Norfolk, who comes in person to Elizabeth while she's on one of her kind of grand processions around the country. I think she's actually in Wiltshire at the time. So the Duke of Norfolk comes to the Queen in Wiltshire, and he makes this stunning confession. He says, I've actually secretly been negotiating behind your back to marry Mary Queen of Scots. I hope you're all right with that.
Insane.
Elizabeth is absolutely not all right with this, because the Duke of Norfolk is her own second cousin. So he has royal blood. So if he marries Mary Queen of Scots, I mean, that is a very, very kind of dangerous combination. He's also incredibly rich. He's by far the wealthiest landowner in the country after Elizabeth herself. And the worst thing of all is that even though he's been raised a Protestant, everyone knows that he's a crypto-Catholic. I mean, I suppose if they all know he's crypto-Catholic, he's not really crypto.
He's hiding in plain sight.
Well, everyone knows basically he's Catholic. So he's kind of rich. He's got royal blood. He's Catholic. He's been kind of negotiating with Mary Queen of Scots to marry her. This is really bad news. And the only reason that he could possibly turn up and tell Elizabeth this and think that she won't kind of blow a gasket is because he's madly arrogant and obtuse.
And yet a member of the aristocracy. I mean, who could possibly have guessed that?
There's a certain Andrew Mountbatten Windsor quality to his political antennae, I think. And so when Elizabeth explodes and she says, what are you thinking? Why are you contemplating doing this? He calms her down by saying that when he was in his tennis court at Norwich, he thought himself in a manner equal with some kings. So it's fine. I can marry Queen of Scots because I am basically a king.
That's insane. That really is absolutely bonkers.
Yeah. So Elizabeth is furious. She kind of tells Norfolk to go back to his estate and stay there. And she puts the militia on full alert across the country. She closes down the East Anglian ports in case ships full of Spanish sailors are going to be descending on them. And she gives her blessing to Cecil to do what he feels needs to be done. And this is the kind of order that Cecil loves.
Yeah.
Go in hard, rip out the treason and the treachery. And Cecil does go in hard. So on the 1st of October, he has the Duke of Norfolk arrested and placed in the Tower. And then in the 6th of October, he has a private meeting with the Queen. And again, he goes in hard about Mary, Queen of Scots. And he says, the Queen of Scots indeed is and shall always be a dangerous person to your estate. Implication, let's execute her. Elizabeth is not ready to do that, but she has basically given the green light to Cecil that you can do what you like with the Duke of Norfolk. And so shortly afterwards, Cecil licenses the publication of a pamphlet, which is called Discourse Touching the Pretended Match Between the Duke of Norfolk and the Queen of Scots. And this is a kind of classic Cecil maneuver. You leak things. You kind of hand vital information to people who then kind of smuggle it out without actually acknowledging where it's come from. I mean, again, it's kind of very familiar to contemporary politics, the well-placed leak. And this pamphlet very savagely attacks Norfolk as a papist. Says, he's not a Protestant at all. He's a servant of the Pope. He's dangerous and evil. Goes in hard against Mary again, condemns her as a competitor of the crown, a thing publicly known, harps on her Frenchness, emphasizes her family connections to the Guise, the sinister French noble family, the arch Catholics, describes them as a race that is both enemy to God and the common quiet of Europe, and emphasizes how Mary is related to them. So this is blackening both Norfolk and Mary, and it's clearly serving Cecil's purposes. It's clearly been commissioned by him. And the author of this pamphlet almost certainly is a protege of Cecil's, who is a very sober man, a very subtle man like Cecil, again like Cecil, a very committed Protestant. And this is a man who will be playing a key role in our story. He's a man called Francis Walsingham.
Well, he's another very impressive man, isn't he? So he's an ultra-Protestant, and he has a sort of, well, didn't Elizabeth call him a rank Puritan? And he has a very sort of Puritan look and sort of vibe to him. He looks sort of austere. He wears black.
White ruff, but otherwise, yeah.
White ruff, yeah. He's got a sort of watchful, contemplative, subtle, dangerously quiet. That's the kind of person he is.
Yes, hooded eyes.
But as a double act, I mean, they must rank alongside. I mean, they're not Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, that's for sure. I mean, they rank alongside the most effective political double acts in England's history.
I think with both of them, their menace and incredible ability kind of shade into one another. They are absolutely not the kind of people that you want to be up against. And that is why Elizabeth employs them. She recognises how effective they are, and they're playing the role that she as queen can't. I mean, that's another reason. It's not just that she's a woman. She recognises that she has a role to play as a figurehead for her people, but she needs competent, brilliant people who are doing her work. And Cecil, she's appointed Cecil. Cecil has appointed Walsingham. So it's kind of working.
And they're both, I mean, Walsingham, like Cecil, is completely devoted to the regime, isn't he? If Elizabeth falls, you know, he's for the high jump, effectively. I mean, he's got tremendous qualities. He's a master of tongues, right? He speaks French, Italian. He's travelled in Europe. You know, he's a very impressive and sophisticated person.
So he understands how the Catholic powers work. I mean, he's a consummate kind of cold warrior, if you want to put it like that. He understands the enemy. It's because he understands the enemy that he is so committed to fighting the enemy. And like Cecil, he has no room for complacency. So he thinks it's much better to be paranoid than complacent. And in 1568, he had written to Cecil, "There is less danger in fearing too much than too little," which is, I think, a motto not just for the 16th century, but for the ages. I mean, it's the universal motto that all governments should bear in mind. And so he is very committed to supporting Cecil in trying to kind of snuff the flame of Norfolk's incipient rebellion. And so he suspects that maybe there is a conspiracy that is kind of lurking behind Norfolk's approach to Mary Queen of Scots. And sure enough, shortly afterwards, they fix on a guy who seems to be behind the plot. And this isn't an Englishman, but an Italian. And this Italian is taken to Walsingham's house in London and Seething Alley, just by the Tower. And it's in this house that this guy is interrogated by Walsingham, who, as you said, speaks Italian. So the interrogation happens in Italian. And the person who's being interrogated is a Florentine, a banker who's been based in London since 1561. And his name is Roberto Ridolfi. And he has been caught red-handed bringing money into England from the Pope. So the worst of the worst.
And he's been giving it to the servants of the Duke of Norfolk.
Correct. So this is what Walsingham discovers in the process of his interrogation. And not just to the Duke of Norfolk, also to a Scotsman called the Bishop of Ross, who is in London serving Mary Queen of Scots as her agent and ambassador there. So here is the nexus. The Pope is sending money via this guy, Ridolfi, and Ridolfi is then passing the money on to agents of Mary Queen of Scots and agents of the Duke of Norfolk. And it is the Duke of Norfolk and Mary Queen of Scots who are talking about getting married. I mean, how can this not be a threat to Elizabeth?
Just one question about Ridolfi, the Ridolfi plot. There's no suspicion that he's been framed.
Dominic, this is a spy thriller. I mean, obviously, nothing is quite as it seems. And we've said that there will be lots of twists and turns. We will see. But I think that for Cecil and for Walsingham, what the Ridolfi plot suggests is, first of all, that yes, the Duke of Norfolk is definitely embroiled in an overly treasonous conspiracy. But worse, that this plot does have an international dimension. Because if the Pope's involved, then it suggests that all the kind of the Catholic powers on the continent are probably involved on this. And, you know, the Pope has no divisions, but he is the Holy Father to both the kings of France and Spain. So what might the Pope's agents have been saying to Philip II of Spain and to France? And let's come to France first, because of course France is the traditional enemy, always happy to stir up mischief in England, even if you take out the whole Catholic Protestant thing. And Cecil's anxieties about France are focused on this family that we've been mentioning throughout the series, the Guise. And in particular, on one guy in particular, who's only 19 years old. He is the Duke of Guise, Henri, the Duke of Guise, but let's call him Henry. And to Protestants in England, Henry of Guise is the absolute archetype of a sinister Catholic Machiavel. So he is the cousin of Mary Stuart. So of course he wants her on the English throne. But he's even more notorious because of whose son he is. So again, to pursue a kind of contemporary analogy, Henry Duke of Guise, only 19, is feared by Protestants in England in perhaps the way that people in a country that borders Russia would be afraid of Vladimir Putin's son, if such a person existed, succeeding him.
Right.
You know, there's a sense that father and son here are both, you know, they're both bad guys, bad hombres, as Trump would call them.
It's like one of Saddam's sons or something.
Yes, or Gaddafi. So Henry of Guise's father, Francis, this is the guy who had been Mary Queen of Scots' uncle. And so he's the ultimate Cecil bogeyman. He'd also captured Calais in the reign of Mary Tudor. So, you know, that's very bad from an English point of view. He had a very, very sinister scar. So that doesn't help. But I think worst of all, and understandably so from Cecil's point of view, in 1562, Francis of Guise had perpetrated an open massacre of French Protestants. And there are a lot of Protestants in France. They're called Huguenots for reasons that are never entirely clear. And in this massacre, 50 French Protestants had been left dead, and these included 5 women and 1 child. And to Cecil, this massacre serves as evidence of what a Catholic nobleman like the Duke of Norfolk might do in England, given half a chance, and in turn what the consequences might then be for the stability of the English state, because in France, that massacre perpetrated by Francis of Guise, the father of Henry of Guise, in 1562, had seen the country erupt into full-blown civil war, Catholics against Huguenots. You know, the kind of religious anarchy that Cecil is desperate to stop. And in France, over the course of the 1560s, you'd had massacre after massacre, battle after battle, murder after murder. Now, actually, Henry's father Francis had been, who'd been at the head of the Catholic cause, the guy kind of prosecuting the campaign against the Huguenots. He had been assassinated in 1563, so that's the year after the Civil War had broken out, by a Huguenot marksman. So we said this is the age where people are starting to use firearms to kill enemies. But the Civil War had blazed on, despite the fact that Francis of Guise had been shot. And it's this kind of toxic mix of religious and personal hatreds, as so often happens in civil wars. And Henry, the young Duke of Guise, this guy he's still in his teens, he embodies both these, you know, the sectarian and the personal. So he's absolutely determined to eradicate heresy, Protestantism in France, but he also wants to be avenged on the man that he blames for the assassination of his father. And the guy that Henry of Guise blames for the murder of Francis, his father, is a very distinguished soldier from Burgundy called Gaspard de Coligny. And Coligny's had a very, very distinguished career. He'd fought in Italy. He'd become the governor of Paris. The following year, he'd become the Admiral of France, which doesn't actually mean that he's sailing around on ships. It means that basically he's number 2 to the Constable of France, who is the kind of the main military officer in the French kingdom. And originally, Coligny and Francis of Guise had been great mates. They hung out at the court. They, you know, had a great time, complete lads together. But then in 1558, Coligny had become a Protestant. He'd had a kind of Calvinist conversion, and Calvin, actually, the great Protestant reformer, had written to him, and they'd become kind of pen pals. And so by the 1560s, he is the leader of the Huguenots in this civil war against the Catholics, against the Guise. And whether Coligny had actually commissioned the murder of Henry of Guise's father, is unclear, but definitely Henry of Guise thinks that Coligny had commissioned it. And therefore, there is a personal as well as a religious motivation in the fact that the Guise refused to make peace with the Huguenots. It's personal for them as well as a matter of ideology and principle. And so there's no real prospect, I think, with Coligny and Guise at the head of the respective sides in this French Civil War, of the wounds being kind of bound up and healed.
So when Cecil and Walsingham look at their map, which they undoubtedly like, you can imagine them together in the study, looking out over the garden and then looking down at the map and shaking their heads in a sort of performative way. So they see France and they say, well, France is an object lesson in what happens when you have religious tension, when you have plotting, when you have Catholic conspirators, all of this. But then they look slightly to the northeast. So they look at the Low Countries and they say, my God, this really is the fate that could await England, because in the Low Countries, it's total chaos and bloodshed, isn't it? So that's Belgium and Holland, effectively.
Yes, because there you have Philip II, who rules the Low Countries. He's their lord. Their Protestantism has put down really quite strong roots. And Philip II, as a devout Catholic, is absolutely determined to eradicate it for good. So in France, you have civil war between Catholics and Protestants. And in the Low Countries, you have a Catholic superpower trying to crush and stamp out the green shoots of godly religion. And this had been prompted in 1566 by this great firestorm of iconoclastic fury, the Beeldenstorm. It's called in Dutch, which was Protestant mobs kind of running amok, ransacking Catholic churches, smashing up icons and all of that. And Philip is not going to put up with this. So in 1567, he had sent the hardest man in Spain, a guy called the Duke of Alva, who is a Castilian bred of the same steel that had bred Cortes and Pizarro. Alva is a veteran of wars against the Turks. He fought in Italy, and he is a brilliant general. And he arrives in the Low Countries with a very large Spanish army. And he sets up this Council of Troubles, it's called, to repress the Protestant insurrection. And the Protestants are very soon calling it the Court of Blood, because it leads to mass executions, thousands of people, including very distinguished Protestant noblemen. And huge numbers of Protestants flee this persecution for England. In due course, this persecution will result in one of the momentous episodes in European history, the Dutch Revolt, which we talked about in our episode on the Dutch national anthem.
That was a great episode.
But we didn't really talk about that on the impact of all this on England, because in England, the repression and the slaughter in the Low Countries, it provokes outrage, it provokes horror, it provokes calls for solidarity. Refugees are being given sanctuary in towns and cities across southern England. And I think it definitely consolidates that sense that you were talking about, Dominic, this idea that we still have of Tudor England, of Elizabethan England, as a land of maypoles and jollity and peace. I think that although clearly there are massive tensions in England, people in England, Catholics, I think, as well as Protestants, do look across the seas to France, to the Low Countries, and they do see this great arc of slaughter and bloodshed. The bodies floating in the Loire, the flames licking barns in Normandy, the corpses littering the streets of Antwerp or whatever. And they do think of Elizabeth as a kind of fairy queen, as she will come to be called by Spencer. They do think of her as a kind of magical protectress. There's actually it's brilliantly phrased by Garrett Mattingly, who wrote one of my favourite ever books on the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And, that English people in this period see Elizabeth as warding from her island the threatening march of history. And I think there is a kind of sense of that. And that is why Cecil is so desperate to stop the threatening march of history, if you want to put it like that.
I think that's true of the Tudors generally, Tom, actually. That's my controversial opinion about the Tudors. Is people think of the Tudors as melodramatic and colourful, and there's a sense of instability and soap opera drama. But I actually think the Tudors' great achievement is to keep England fairly stable and united, relatively united. When you look at what's going on the continent, I mean, it's total bloodshed and chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. And Elizabeth has a huge role to play in this. She is the kind of the woman who charms and woos her own people and who plays hard to get with kind of Catholic suitors on the continent. So, she's magnificent at that. But then you do have Cecil and Walsingham, who are hard in the way that you need to be hard to keep your kingdom secure and stable. And so one of the ways in which they display this hardness is that in 1568, 4 Spanish treasure ships loaded down with the silver from the New World, the mines in Peru. They're chased by pirates and they have to take refuge in English ports. And so Cecil says, well, I think we'll keep it. And the justification for this is that the money was going to be used to fund the Duke of Alva. But it's also the reason that Elizabeth likes it is that she's always short of money. She's incredibly stingy. And so brilliant. We've got this kind of incredible windfall. There is, of course, a problem with doing this in that it really annoys the King of Spain. And in 1569, so the year following the arrival of these treasure ships in English ports, Cecil writes to Elizabeth and says, very bluntly, that you and your government are, and I quote, most offensive both to the King of Spain and the French King for sundry considerations, and specially for succouring of the persecuted. In other words, for taking the side of the persecuted Protestants in France and in the Low Countries.
So to use another analogy from a series we've done on The Rest is History, when we talked about the origins of the First World War, there's a perception in Austria-Hungary, a big power, that Serbia, a sort of gadfly, is fomenting treason and unrest and is giving aid to terrorists and all of that kind of thing. And that lies, it's the heart of the process that leads to the outbreak of the First World War. Well, there must be people in the courts of France and Spain who are saying similar things about England, that England is becoming a rogue state that is supporting terrorists.
Completely there are. And so it's an incredible tightrope for Elizabeth and Cecil to walk, to take the measures that enable England to hold her head up, and to kind of bulk up her defences and not to allow sand to be kicked in her face, while at the same time trying not to go too far and not provoke kind of, say, the sending of an enormous fleet up the channel, an armada, because that would be very bad. And so I think by the late 1560s, 1569, when Cecil wrote that report, it's not surprising that he thinks that things are looking pretty bleak, because you have all this bloodshed across the channel, a kind of grim forewarning of what might come to England should he fail in his mission. There's this whole courtship thing between the Duke of Norfolk and Mary Queen of Scots. That's very ominous. 2 Catholics, both with royal Tudor blood in their veins, wanting to get hitched up. You can't allow that. And then you've got this guy Ridolfi, who you mentioned. We talked about him. Is he all that he seems? He seems to have been acting as this conduit between the Pope and the Duke of Norfolk and Mary Queen of Scots. So what's going on with him? So all of these are very worrying. And then in very rapid succession, 2 further developments. So in December 1569, 2 Catholic noblemen in the north of England, which we said is the place where probably Catholicism is at its most militant. And these are very, very significant players in the politics of Northern England. So Thomas Percy, heir of the Percys, the great family of Northumberland. He's the Earl of Northumberland, and Charles Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland, so on the other side of the coast from Northumberland. The pair of them rise in revolt. And their object, they make this clear, is to liberate Mary Stuart and to restore Catholicism. And as an index of this, they capture Durham and they celebrate Mass in Durham Cathedral, the first time since Elizabeth's accession. And Elizabeth is merciless in her repression of this revolt. So 700 of the rebels are hanged and their bodies are left to rot in gibbets. The church bells that had been used to ring the rebellion, to raise the rebels, are melted down. And those rebels who do manage to escape abroad, which include Westmoreland, they will live out their lives on the continent as marked and hunted men. So if we compare Elizabeth's repression of what she sees as heresy with that of Mary's, Mary was responsible for the death of 300 heretics. Elizabeth has sanctioned the execution of 400 more people than that.
So the difference, though, is that they have risen in revolt. So if you rise in revolt, you know what you're getting into.
Yeah, you could say that. But she is at least as robust in her approach to stamping out a sedition as Mary was.
We are very keen on robust statesmanship at The Rest is History, and I just want to make that very clear to all our listeners.
We've had this rising of the North, which has been stamped out. But then a few weeks after the suppression of that revolt comes something that is much harder to stamp out, because it doesn't take the form of an armed uprising. It takes the form of a papal bull. And Dominic, a menacing papal bull is nothing that you want to get when you're an embattled Protestant regime.
I dread getting a papal bull. I mean, literally, when postman comes, I worry about a papal bull.
So this papal bull is published, obviously, by the Pope. That's what makes it papal. And this is Pius V. And it's called Regnans in Excelsis, which is the first line of the bull, which means reigning on high. And by the terms of this bull, the pretended Queen of England, as it describes Elizabeth, is excommunicated at last. We said the Pope has been itching to do this. Philip has been kind of holding the Pope on a tight leash. And I think the Pope takes his chance. Philip is distracted and he kind of publishes it. And this is really, really devastating for Elizabeth and for her government, because it doesn't only license English Catholics to renounce their loyalty to Elizabeth, it positively demands it. So to quote the bull, this is the Pope speaking: "We charge and command all and singular the nobles, subjects, peoples, and others aforesaid, that they do not dare obey her orders, mandates, and laws. Those who shall act to the contrary, we include in the like sentence of excommunication."
So this is really raising the stakes. If you want to, stay in the bosom of the church, you have to, you must treat Elizabeth as a heretic and as a traitor and ignore her and whatnot. But effectively, this goes beyond that, because what the Pope is saying, isn't he, is that actually she is a legitimate target now of plotting and indeed of assassination. If you're a good Catholic and you want to, this is effectively like a fatwa. He's issued a fatwa against Elizabeth I.
So it's really bad news. And on top of that, Cecil is pretty clear from intelligence reports that the Pope had kind of been slipping money to the rising in the north, so he's behind that. You've got the Duke of Guise, you've got Henry the Duke of Guise, you've got the Duke of Alva. They both have massive armies on the other side of the Channel from England, steeped in Protestant blood. So that's very bad news. And at the centre of the web, all along, the whole time, the person to whom all these plots are leading back, you have the blood-gorged spider that is Mary Stuart. And so in 1571, Cecil feels that he's got the proof he needs to go to the Queen and say, look, we need urgent action. And for 2 years, so ever since the arrest of Roberto Ridolfi, that Florentine banker who'd been supplying Norfolk and Mary Stuart with the funds from the Pope, Cecil's agents have been working really hard behind the scenes to bring the full facts of the plot to light. And what their efforts have resulted in is very, very shocking. So Cecil's agents have managed to prove that the Duke of Norfolk had been plotting to free and then marry Mary, that he and Mary had been working hand in glove, not just with papal ambassadors, but with the French and the Spanish ambassadors in London, that there was to be a rebellion in London, that a Spanish army was to cross from the Low Countries. So that was why Elizabeth had closed the ports on the eastern coast to stop them from landing there. And that Mary, Queen of Scots, was to be proclaimed Queen of England. And all of this, it's been done undercover. Cecil wants it out in the public. So he does the classic wheeze of, a leak. And he does it in the form of a fabricated letter, which gets published and unsurprisingly goes viral. So it's kind of like the equivalent of a newspaper expose. Everybody's reading it and going, oh, this is terrible.
And we know for sure the letter was fabricated, right?
Yes, we do. So people might be, well, if the letter's fabricated, are the details necessarily true? And Dominic, you implied that perhaps Cecil was playing a complicated game. Maybe the letter is the expression of what Cecil believes to be true but can't 100% prove, or possibly Ridolfi, during the process of interrogation by Walsingham, might have been turned and actually become a double agent, have ended up working for Cecil and for Elizabeth's cause. And we will never know because we don't have the papers to solve this. But I think these are absolutely the right kinds of questions to be asking. There is definitely a sense of a plot there, but who where exactly the lines are to be drawn in the kind of the balance of all the conspirators is more complex. And just to quote Stephen Orford again in his biography of Cecil, he offers a suggestion that Ridolfi was a plant, that the whole conspiracy was a setup from the start, a plot manufactured by Cecil to expose Mary Stuart for the danger he knew her to be.
Just to focus in on that for a second, Stephen Orford is not claiming that the whole thing is an utter fiction. What he's effectively saying, isn't he, is that Cecil and Walsingham know that the Pope and various other bad people are plotting against England, and they have they basically fabricated the evidence. But he's not denying. I mean, the plot definitely, as insofar as if plot is the right word, the scheme exists.
Yeah, that it does, and that they need to expose it, and that they do this essentially by turning Ridolfi and getting him to make kind of statements that can then be used. And there is kind of evidence for this. So amazingly, Ridolfi has a private audience with the Queen at Greenwich Palace, which is quite odd. Also, when the plot is revealed, Ridolfi is safely back in Italy, where actually, if he's a double agent, he then becomes a triple agent, because he ends up becoming a papal senator in Florence and lives to a very ripe old age. I mean, he dies in his 80s. So I think there's a definite, there is a kind of real Le Carré quality to it. Smoke and mirrors. You're never entirely sure whose side Ridolfi is on. But I think that while he is in England and being menaced by Cecil, he's on Cecil's side. And then probably when he gets back to Italy, he changes sides again. So he gets off it. But someone who doesn't get off scot-free is the Duke of Norfolk, because he ends up having his head chopped off. He may be Elizabeth's second cousin, and he may be England's preeminent nobleman, but he's been caught bang to rights. But what about Mary Queen of Scots? Cecil is going really hard in, saying to the Queen, look, you cannot be secure on your throne while she is alive. You have to get rid of her. And Elizabeth says no, for the reasons that we've said. You cannot execute one of God's anointed. And there are all kinds of attempts, fostered by Cecil, fostered by Walsingham, to get Parliament to try and petition her. So you have the bishops in the House of Lords. The late Scottish Queen hath heaped up together all the sins of the licentious sons of David, adultery, murder, conspiracy, treasons, and blasphemies against God, and therefore should be put to death. But Elizabeth says no. And Cecil, as a result of this, even as he's triumphant that he's foiled the Duke of Norfolk's plot, is kind of plunged into fury and despair at Elizabeth's obduracy as he sees it. He can't believe that he's not allowed to sweep Mary Queen of Scots from the board. But Elizabeth and Cecil, they've had this massive bust up, but Cecil is still confident that he has Elizabeth's backing. She may be capricious and infuriating, but she still trusts him. And I think that's the key to the teamwork that they embody. So in December 1571, Elizabeth expels the Spanish ambassador for his involvement in the Ridolfi plot. And it makes perfectly clear that she believes in the existence of this plot. So she tells the Spanish ambassador, you would secretly seek to inflame our realm with firebrands. So again, it's so like the Cold War in Britain or the United States, where spy networks get exposed in the Soviet embassy, and the Soviet ambassador gets expelled. It's exactly like that. And so Elizabeth knows that she owes Cecil for this. I mean, he may be hassling her to execute Mary Queen of Scots, and she's not going to give in to that. But she does know that he has done her a kind of an amazing turn. That without him, she would be in all kinds of peril. So in February 1571, she bestows a signal honour on him. So William Cecil, this humble Welshman from Lincolnshire, he gets raised to the ranks of the nobility, and he's given the title of the Baron of Burghley. And today, people are endlessly being given titles and knighthoods and things by the government. But Elizabeth is much more chary. So it is a huge deal for Cecil to be given this honour. And henceforth, he will be known as Lord Burghley. And that's what we'll be calling him, Lord Burghley. And Lord Burghley is on hand to continue his godly war against the threats from Antichrist, whether it be Catholics in England, Mary Queen of Scots, the King of France, the King of Spain, the Pope. They are all still out there, and they are all still looking to menace the Protestants of England and the reign of good Queen Bess.
Well, it's actually, I mean, not only are they still looking to do it, but actually the threats are becoming more and more serious, aren't they? And the skies are getting darker and darker. Because just 12 weeks after the execution of the Duke of Norfolk, who I think everybody agrees had it coming, that was on the 24th of August, 1572. 12 weeks later, something happens in the streets of Paris that sends shockwaves through Protestant Europe. And this is a pogrom, a massacre beyond even Cecil's worst nightmares, the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. And on hand to see it is the other person we've been talking about today, Francis Walsingham, who had been sent by Elizabeth I to serve as her ambassador in France. And what Walsingham sees that day in Paris will never leave him. It's stamped on his imagination for the rest of his life, as it is stamped on the imaginations of everybody in England. And it confirms him and Cecil in all their darkest suspicions of the papist Catholic menace and their dread of the Catholic enemy within.
Cousin, 'tis he, I know him by his look. See where my soldier shot him through the arm. He missed him near, but we have struck him now. Ah, thou base degenerate, chief standard-bearer to the Lutherans. Thus, in despite of thy religion, the Duke of Guise stamps on thy lifeless bulk. Away with him. Cut off his head and hands, and send them for a present to the Pope. And when this just revenge is finished, unto Mount Faucon will we drag his corpse. And he that living hated so the cross shall, being dead, be hanged thereon in chains. Now no delay. Go and shoot the ordnance off, that they which have already set the street may know their watchword, and then toll the bell. And so, let's forward to the massacre.
Chilling.
So that was the sinister Henry, Duke of Guise, as ventriloquized by Christopher Marlowe in his tragedy, The Massacre at Paris, which he wrote in 1593. And what that play describes is the most infamous bloodbath in all 16th century European history. It is the massacre, the pogrom against French Protestants, or Huguenots as they were called, which began on the 24th of August, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day. And Marlowe was writing his play 2 decades later. But the events of that day, the bloodshed in the streets of Paris, were still stamped onto the imaginations of English Protestants. They haunted their dreams, because this was the proof beyond any possible doubt, that Catholics were set on extirpating the true religion, the true Protestant faith, that they were plotting and conspiring to destroy Protestantism, and that if they were ever given the opportunity, there was no atrocity, no barbarism, no crime, no cruelty that they would not commit in the name of their hellish fanatical devotion to the Bishop of Rome and his underlings. And Tom, people may be thinking, well, this is very overstated and very melodramatic, but actually what the Duke of Guise is promising in that speech, the massacre, he's punished this bloke. What's happened to this one guy is going to happen to thousands of other people. I mean, this is not so far from the reality of what actually did happen that day in Paris, is it?
Yeah, as we'll see, Marlowe is drawing on contemporaneous accounts for his drama. And even though in the play, the Duke of Guise is a kind of classic Tudor dramatic Machiavel, kind of cackling and all of that, the words in his speech do correspond, as you said, to what happened. So the guy who was shot through the arm at the beginning of that speech, and then he gets dispatched by Guise's men, and the Duke of Guise himself kind of jumps on him. So that is the Admiral of France. He's a very distinguished soldier called Gaspard de Coligny. And the reason that the Duke of Guise is so triumphant as he stands over the corpse of Coligny, as he is in the play, is because Guise, although by now he's 21, so still a very, very young man, he is the most powerful Catholic nobleman in France, and Coligny is the leader of the Huguenots, the French Protestants. Guise's hatred for Coligny is personal as well as sectarian, because he blames the admiral for having sponsored the assassination of his father 9 years before. And so listeners may be wondering, well, there is this intense ideological and personal hatred between the Duke of Guise and Coligny. What on earth are they doing, in the same city? Why are they in the same place if there's this civil war raging on? They are there because a ritual has been celebrated, which it is hoped may end the civil war in France between Catholics and Protestants. And it's a wedding between a Catholic and a Protestant. So the Catholic is the sister of the French king, Charles IX, and she has married the Protestant king of Navarre, who inevitably is also called Henry. And as a rule of thumb in this period in France, almost everyone important is called Henry. And there will be more to come. People will be excited to learn. And Coligny, the Protestant, has been invited as a particular guest of honor. So there's this idea that, Catholics and Protestants are going to be reconciled. Now, Guise, who strongly disapproved of this wedding, he has seized his chance for vengeance. So first of all, he sponsored this assassination attempt on Coligny, and this was the shooting that had left Coligny, as Marlowe puts it, shot through the arm. And then 2 days later, Guise sends a death squad to attack Coligny directly in his rooms. And they arrive there and they find that a unit of musketeers have been stationed outside the doorway leading up to Coligny's quarters. And they've been sent there by the king on Charles IX's orders to protect Coligny against any threats from Catholic intruders. But the musketeers, when the Duke of Guise's men arrive, they go, brilliant. Yeah, let's kill him. And so they force the door. They clatter their way up the steps. They burst into Coligny's room. They murder him. And then they hurl the body out from the window down into the street where the Duke of Guise is standing. And the Duke of Guise then tramples Coligny's corpse down. And worse is to follow. And it's described by a Huguenot lawyer called François Ottman. And he writes, Coligny remained exposed to all sorts of ignominy, with some of his limbs cut off. He was dragged through the mud and finally, after 3 days, was strung up by the feet at Montfaucon, where he remained for several days as a trophy and a mark of the cruelty and rage which the people of Paris exacted on him, not just in life, but also on his dead body. And Ottman's account of this massacre was one of many that were translated into English, and it was very, very influential. And you can tell how Marlowe drew on it very precisely for his play. So that's the end of Coligny. But meanwhile, Guise's men are hunting down Coligny's lieutenants and killing them. And at the same time, there's a kind of trigger effect, because in the Louvre, the Swiss guards who protect the king have woken up all the Protestant noblemen who are staying in the Louvre as Charles IX's guests. They have disarmed these Protestant noblemen and then slaughtered them en masse. And all the while, as described in Marlowe's play, so there's this kind of tolling of the bell, the tocsin of the Church of Saint-Germain is sounding, and it's a signal for a wholesale massacre, an uprising of Catholics across Paris against their Protestant neighbours.
So this is this extraordinary, dramatic event that plays such a massive part in the story of Europe in the 16th century, but also of Elizabethan England's relationship with its neighbours. So we're going to get right into the details of the massacre. This is a classic sectarian mob violence, but it's been masterminded, right? There are signals, there are very powerful people who are controlling it, and there's a sort of deliberate cold-bloodedness to it, that there's been these years of tension and violence between Catholics and Protestants, but this is a genuine, premeditated attempt to settle accounts once and for all, and basically to kill all the Protestants in Paris. Was that too strong?
Well, I mean, the details of the slaughter are hideous. So maybe up to 5,000 Protestants murdered in Paris, tens of thousands more in copycat massacres across France. And as you say, I mean, it is undoubtedly fueled by sectarian hatred. And a measure of this, I mean, it's really horrible, is that a lot of the slaughter that is inflicted on the Huguenots and I'm quoting here from the definitive new book on the massacre by Joanna Alette. And she writes that the Catholic slaughter of the Huguenots corresponded to a wish to destroy all chances of proliferation by the group that their murderers sought to eliminate. And so what that meant in effect was that Protestant men were not just murdered, they were castrated, that pregnant women had their bellies slashed open and the fetuses pulled out, and that children were targeted for wholesale butchery, which was framed by Protestants, understandably, as a new massacre of the innocents. So when Herod sent his soldiers to slaughter the innocents in Bethlehem. And one of the Protestant narratives described how the Seine was full of empty children's cradles from which the assassins had torn the newborn in order to steal their swaddling clothes before drowning them. And there's another very notorious account written by a Calvinist pastor who described seeing a young child being held by a Catholic with a large beard. And this child was kind of gurgling with delight as reached with his tiny fingers to play with the curls of the Catholic's beard. And then the Catholic hurled the small child to his death into the Seine.
People may be saying, well, I mean, God, we've heard stories like this 1,000 times and the rest is history. And is this not just pure Protestant propaganda, rather like the propaganda that you had in the 1640s about the Catholic uprising in Ireland? And there were claims that, you know, lots of Protestants were being massacred and these hideous kind of often sexual kind of crimes and whatnot. Is this more of the same, or is there genuine substance in these claims?
Well, Protestants are definitely writing these terms, but so too are Catholics. So here is a Catholic witness. Naked bodies lay pierced by 1,000 stabs in the streets. No distinction was made for sex, age, or the status of people. And there are scenes of completely emblematic horror which haunt the age. And they are described by Catholics as well as by Protestants. So to give you some of these scenes of horror, there's a famous professor at the University of Paris who was murdered, defenestrated as Coligny had been chucked out of a window, and disemboweled, and his corpse is then lashed with whips by schoolboys. So it's a kind of emblem of order turned upside down. There's a Protestant bookseller who is burnt alive on a pyre fashioned out of the books from his shop. And there is a woman who was tied by her hair to the arch of the bridge by Notre Dame, and she hung there for 3 days before the corpse of her husband was dropped on top of her and dragged her down into the Seine. Thus, they were united in their burial. I mean, some of these stories sound kind of too emblematic, perhaps, to be true, but I think that you don't get stories like those coming from both sides of the sectarian divide unless the scenes of slaughter really are horrific.
And isn't what one of the things that adds to it the fact that when the news of the massacre first breaks, the reaction of a lot of French Catholics is not one of embarrassment or shame or anything like that, but unbridled delight and joy.
Well, in France, I mean, the Catholics are, I mean, not all of them, but across cities in France, they are doing copycat massacres. But I think what's really shocking, and particularly to Protestants, but also actually to a lot of Catholics as well, is the reaction from the leading figures in the Catholic world. So the Pope ordered a Te Deum to be sung, and he issued a commemorative medal which showed an angel with a cross and a drawn sword killing heretics. So he's basically saying, this is great, fantastic, here's a medal. And Philip II of Spain, the most powerful Catholic king, when he receives the news of the massacre, he goes to a monastery to pray and to give thanks to God. And then he returns to court and he speaks to the French ambassador and laughs and says that your master, Charles IX, well, he truly deserves his title of most Christian king for this godly massacre. So that's the initial response. But I do think that in due course, when the full details of what has happened starts to emerge, that there is a kind of feeling of embarrassment among Catholics who had celebrated the massacre as a kind of godly cleansing. And the excitement comes to be replaced almost by a sense of shame. And in fact, even at the time in Paris, there were Catholics who were appalled by the slaughter. So monasteries in the capital had provided shelter to Huguenot fugitives. And individual Catholics too had very bravely offered shelter and refuge to Protestants who were fleeing mobs. And intriguingly, and this really complicates the kind of the sense that we have from Elizabethan propaganda about the Guise, this very powerful Catholic family. The Duke of Guise offered shelter to fugitive Catholics.
And is this because basically it had got out of hand from what he'd originally planned? He'd planned this as an internal aristocratic, as settling accounts in an aristocratic feud, and actually it had then turned into something much bigger. He'd lost control of it in a way.
I think also by offering Protestant noblemen against whom he doesn't have a grudge shelter, he's getting, he's building up credit with them. So he's always kind of calculating. So to that extent, it may be a slightly kind of Machiavellian tactic. I mean, but it may also reflect a kind of genuine sense of compassion. But I mean, he wasn't very compassionate when he was trampling down the corpse of Coligny, it has to be said.
No.
The fact that Guise can commission the assassination of Coligny and then offer shelter to Huguenot fugitives later on, I think implies the fact that what we call the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre wasn't just a single massacre. It was a whole kind of confluence of blood feuds and pogroms. So Guise's attack on Coligny and his followers had fused with Charles IX's very opportunistic murder of the Protestant nobleman in his care. And the news of these murders, I think, then had in turn inspired a kind of sectarian bloodlust that had gripped the whole of Paris. And so lots of the Protestants who are killed, I mean, they're killed maybe because they're Protestant, but they're also killed probably, maybe there was a kind of rival bookseller who got rid of that, the Huguenot bookseller or whatever.
They're the worst, aren't they, booksellers?
Yeah, Catholic booksellers. And this is what Joanna Arlett in her recently published book argues. And I think it's been a kind of revelatory text. People have kind of really accepted the force of that argument.
But if you're looking at it from England, come on, if you're looking at it from England, though, I mean, you're not saying, oh, well, there's extenuating circumstances. Naturally, there are lots of different massacres here, and let's not conflate them. You're looking at this and you're saying, come on, we've been telling you for years that Catholics are evil conspirators who are plotting to kill us all. And guess what? They've just done it in Paris.
Yeah. I mean, we know that if you see people from a different religious tradition as a kind of mass, and you're telling that they're going to do terrible things, and then something terrible does get done in the name of that religion, of course you're tempted to feel that all your darkest suspicions have been confirmed. Of course. Yeah. And that's undoubtedly what happens with Protestants in England. And William Cecil, Elizabeth I's chief minister, became Lord Burleigh, so let's call him Burleigh. When he gets the news from Paris, he takes for granted that this is the manifestation of Satan's workings. And he, all along, right the way from when he first became Elizabeth's first minister, when she ascended the throne, he has been convinced that there is a Catholic international conspiracy to overthrow the cause of Protestantism in England. And that foreign Catholics, like the Pope, like the Duke of Guise, like Philip II, all of whom, as he sees it, are implicated in either perpetrating or celebrating the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, that they want to see the same thing happen in England, and that they have a very dark and sinister plan, namely to murder Queen Elizabeth, who is a virgin queen, has no heir, no Protestant heir, no heir at all, and to replace her on the English throne with her Catholic cousin, Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots, who is a prisoner in England. And that the Pope in particular has made his ambitions for this plot very clear by 2 years before, in 1570, excommunicating Elizabeth and telling Catholics with the full force of, a papal bull, that they have to work actively for her overthrow, essentially kind of try to eliminate her, maybe by assassination or whatever.
But doesn't the massacre in Paris suggest that actually the Catholic plotters' ambitions might go further, that it's not just about assassinating one person, the Queen, but they might, if they got the chance, they would carry out a similar bloodbath, in the streets of London or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's bolstered in this view by the man who had been appointed by Elizabeth to serve as her ambassador in France. And this is none other than Francis Walsingham. Like Cecil, Lord Burleigh, he's a very passionate Protestant. He's very subtle and implacable in his service to the Queen. He is a guy who is very skilled and practiced at interrogating Catholic spies. And so he is a very, very committed Protestant. And so it must have been incredibly unsettling for him to find himself in the middle of this kind of great pogrom of the Huguenots, particularly since his residence in Paris was very close to the church of Saint-Germain. So that one, the tolling of the bell signaling the onset of the massacre. And he had used his house as a kind of asylum for terrified Huguenots and also for English Protestants. So 3 English Protestants get killed in the massacre, which is pretty low. And that's because Walsingham has been able to provide them with sanctuary. He had also provided sanctuary to a Huguenot general who had been dragged out and hanged by royal troops. And even though Charles IX had posted troops to guard Walsingham's residence, there's no question that Walsingham had been in physical danger. He, his family, his servants, all the kind of people he'd offered refuge to. And for days after the massacre, as he was kind of driving round the streets of Paris in his carriage, the mob would hurl stones at him and yell abuse. And I think the memories of everything that he witnessed stayed with him to the rest of his life, as they would. I think when you have 5,000 of your co-religionists slaughtered in the streets, I mean, that's something you're not going to get over easily.
Exactly, especially, if you're under threat yourself, right?
Yeah, completely. And someone else who was there with him was his brother-in-law, a guy called Robert Beale, who'd been serving Walsingham as his secretary in Paris. And Beale wrote a kind of memorandum, and he summed up the lessons that he was drawing and applied it to England. I think it time and more than time for us to awake out of our dead sleep and take heed lest like mischief, as has already overwhelmed the brethren and neighbours in France and Flanders, embrace us. So in other words, what Catholics have done in Paris, if we give them the chance, they will do the same in London.
That appeal to wake up. We've been asleep. We must wake out of our dead sleep. I mean, that's so common in history.
Wake up, sheeple.
Yeah, exactly. So not long after the massacre, Walsingham comes back to London, doesn't he, from his ambassadorial posting. And we've talked about the parallels with the Cold War, and he is like one of these, American diplomats like George Kennan or somebody in the 1940s and 1950s who had been in Moscow and then came back and said, right, I've seen the beast up close. It's actually worse than you think. We're in an existential life or death struggle with an implacable, sinister adversary. He has come back, if anything, more hawkish.
Yeah, definitely.
Than when he went. And then Lord Burghley gives him a new job, and an absolutely crucial new job.
Well, basically, Burghley gives him his old job. So Lord Burghley had been principal secretary to Elizabeth, and he's now in 1572 he'd been promoted to become the Lord Treasurer, so effectively Prime Minister, First Lord of the Treasury. And so Walsingham now is serving as principal secretary, which in effect means that in addition to handling all the kind of the foreign affairs and things like that, he is basically now the Queen's spymaster. And as the Queen's spymaster, he is responsible for the monitoring and the repression of treasonous activity in England. So to put it in modern parlance, he's the head of MI5. And he has a lot more tools to prosecute this war against sedition than Cecil had at the beginning of his term as chief secretary, because there's been kind of legislative beefing up since the Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth. So in 1571, 1 year after the papal bull excommunicating the Queen, Parliament had passed a new Treason Act, which made it illegal to call Elizabeth, and I quote, heretic, schismatic, tyrant, infidel, or an usurper of the crown. And clearly you don't criminalize people using language like that unless they really have been using it. So clearly people have been calling Elizabeth all those words. They also introduced an act against fugitives over the sea, which required the immediate return to England of anyone who had gone abroad without the specific permission of the government. And they also introduced the kind of laws I imagine, I doubt that Sarah Mullally, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, would personally be keen on these, but it might be one way to revive the Church of England, because the laws that are passed under Elizabeth against recusants, they're called, so people who recusere, people who refuse to attend the services of the Protestant Church of England, they can be imprisoned without trial simply on the orders of the Privy Council.
Just a question. Elizabeth has been queen now for quite a while. 12, 13 years, right?
Yeah.
Why are there people still calling her a usurper of the crown? That seems odd to me. I can understand there would be some Catholics who would call her a heretic or a schismatic.
But she's been there a long time. She's been there longer than Mary was queen.
Because if she is an illegitimate queen, as the Pope has said, one of the reasons for that illegitimacy isn't just her religion. It's also the fact that she is the daughter of a bastard, Anne Boleyn. So Anne Boleyn is seen as a whore. And so she is called the Great Whore, and Elizabeth is called the Little Whore.
Of course. I'm just surprised that it's now quite a long time. People don't live that long in the 16th century. It's quite a long time since Anne Boleyn was around. I know memories die hard, but it's surprising to me that there is obviously a significant minority of people who are still questioning Elizabeth's right to rule.
I don't think it's surprising at all, because I think that the propaganda war on both sides is heating up. And that's always the way, that when you have two ideologically opposed points of view, both sides serve to radicalize the other.
How are they exposed to Catholic propaganda? Because surely the government is straining every sinew to make sure that Catholic propaganda is not distributed.
We are going to be coming to that, because the elision between Catholicism and treason, which those laws are pretty explicitly making, is something that increasingly by the 1570s is starting to animate people like Walsingham. They feel that this sense of a conspiracy between Catholics in England and Catholics in the broader world, in Europe, that far from dying down, as the hope had been, that it's becoming worse and worse and worse, that Catholics are essentially being radicalized, and that they are looking to the Catholic powers beyond England for succor and support. And that's not just financial, it's also in terms of kind of ideology. And we will see the extent to which this is true, because this is pretty much what this episode today is going to be about. And conversely, for people like Walsingham, for Cecil, Lord Burleigh, again, they are becoming more and more nervous of English Catholics and seeing them as more and more of a menace, because Catholics who remain true to their faith, even if they are, simultaneously loyal to Elizabeth, and lots of English Catholics remain loyal to Elizabeth, they are being cast by this kind of, the nervous security apparatus of the Protestant regime as agents of foreign powers, of agents of the Pope, of the kings of Spain and of France. And so therefore, Walsingham's duties as chief intelligencer to the Queen requires him to keep an eye not just on the Catholics in England, but also on the continent. And so effectively, he is working as head of MI6 as well as of MI5. And this is a challenge for him, because even though Walsingham has inherited Burleigh's intelligence networks, these were not institutional in the way that, say, the intelligence networks of Venice were. So Venice had always employed spies and agents and informants across Europe. Walsingham doesn't have anything like that. There isn't really a kind of MI5 or MI6 for him to take over. He's got to kind of build it. And the problem is that, we compared England to Iran in the 21st century. England is very isolated and also relatively poor, doesn't have the kind of the reach and the scope, say, of the agents employed by Philip II. Philip rules this vast Europe-wide empire. He's very rich. He has agents everywhere. He can afford to pay those agents in places where he doesn't rule directly. The Queen is stingy. She's not providing Walsingham with enormous amounts of money. But because Walsingham is a true believer, he invests his own personal fortune in his work. And Robert Beale, his brother-in-law, his kind of secretary, he's become secretary to the Privy Council on his return from Paris. He notes Walsingham's financial as well as ideological commitment to the cause with great admiration. He wrote, "Mr. Secretary Walsingham, with Her Majesty's allowance and his own purse, had recruited agents in 40 locations overseas." So that's pretty impressive. And some of these agents are working in the very heart of foreign governments. So Beale noted in particular those that betrayed the secrets of both the French and Scottish dealings. So lots of agents in the Scottish court and in the French court. But the hardest nuts to crack are the most menacing. And one of these is Spain, the most formidable power. The English don't, the English intelligence services find it difficult to plant agents in Philip's court. And the other, of course, is the papacy, which is an institution with which England obviously has no diplomatic relations at all. And so Walsingham tries to get round this problem. Beale again in his report notes, with money, he corrupted priests and traitors to portray the practices against this realm. And towards the end of the 1570s, he kind of contemplated a mad scheme to kidnap a papal nuncio to France. So he was going to use Huguenot pirates to kidnap this papal nuncio and bring him to England and kind of interrogate him. And Burleigh, who, generally, loves a scheme to foil the Pope, he said, no, this is mad. He nixed the plot. And so people may be, well, why was Walsingham prepared to countenance such a kind of a reckless scheme? And the reason is that he fears a great new crisis is brewing for the Queen and for the cause of true religion, because he is the intelligence chief. He is closer to the reports of his agents now than Burleigh is. And he is abreast of very alarming news reaching him of developments in Rome, where it seems that a new stage in the papacy's campaign against Elizabeth and Protestant England is being prepared. And Rome, it goes without saying, for Protestants, is the absolute sump of everything that is most hellish in Europe at this point. So there's a Protestant spy in England who ultimately ended up as a playwright, kind of like Marlowe and Shakespeare. And he wrote this poem about Rome. It's the sea of sin, the beast with sevenfold head, the shop wherein all shame is sold and bought, the cup whence poison through the world is spread. And in the early 1570s, there is one particular poison that is giving Walsingham a special headaches. The most toxic poison in Christendom, in Walsingham's opinion. And this is administered by the most brilliant, the most committed, the most dangerous of all Elizabeth's enemies. And these are enemies who are preparing for the first time, if Walsingham's intelligence is accurate, to bring their campaign against the Queen directly to English soil. And these enemies, Dominic, are enemies whose very name is sufficient to chill the soul of any devout Protestant. These enemies are the Jesuits.
Oh, no. Well, we'll come back after the break and we will welcome to the rest is history some of the worst people who've ever lived, the Jesuits.
This episode is brought to you by Lloyds. Now, when you have ambitions, being able to see the bigger picture is just so important. And history definitely teaches us that.
My favorite example, not necessarily a brilliant man, but the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés. He was a visionary, he was an adventurer, but he also grasped that the empire of the Aztecs was vulnerable, and he took his men inland, and he was able to bring down the Aztecs with just a handful of men.
And of course, this isn't just a problem for blood-soaked conquistadors. It is true for the rest of us as well, which is where Lloyds comes in. Their app helps you to see all your finances in one place so that you can feel clearer and more confident about what comes next.
And rather like Cortés, you're managing the micro and the macro. So one moment you might be managing day-to-day spending with budgeting insights using the app, or you might be getting guidance if you're thinking about starting a business.
So whatever your next move looks like, you can bank on Lloyds to help you make it with confidence. Visit lloydsbank.com.
Welcome back to The Rest is History. It is September 1579. We are in the sump of sin. We are in Rome itself, and we're at a dinner in a place called the English College. And this is a seminary where English students can train for the Catholic priesthood. And the guest of honour at this dinner is a man who Francis Walsingham, spymaster to Elizabeth I, regards as his most dangerous enemy, putting on one side Mary, Queen of Scots. And the name of this man is William Allen. He is a Catholic priest. He is a scholar. And like the co-founder of Goalhanger, Tony Pastor, he is a man of Lancashire. So a man of Lancashire, educated at Oxford. So he's very like Tony Pastor.
Well, in some ways.
Listeners can tell straight away that this is going to be a very bad man. Tell us about William Allen and why he's such a bad man, Tom. He's got a mole, hasn't he?
He's got a mole. He's got a reddish beard. I mean, it's all stacking up. He's very tall. He's very slim. He's in his late 40s. As you said, he'd been a brilliant student at Oxford. Then he'd been a fellow at Oriel College. So a great, glittering academic career there. But because he's a very devout Catholic, when Elizabeth comes in and establishes the Protestant settlement, he can't put up with it. And so he leaves England and goes into permanent exile. And when he's in exile, he sets up seminaries with the aim of training English Catholic priests who can then be sent back to England. And the first of these seminaries he sets up at Douai in the Low Countries, and the second one at Reims in France. So you were asking, how are people in England being kept abreast of all these developments? It's these priests who are being trained and sent by William Allen to England. Their aim is to kind of keep alive the flame of recusancy in England, to give mass to Catholics and to succour them and to let them know that they haven't been abandoned by the Catholic powers of Europe, but also, if they can, to try and to make conversions. So I guess, again, pursuing the kind of Cold War analogy, KGB agents in Britain, they were kind of there to establish links with pre-existing communists, but also to recruit agents, say in, Cambridge or the civil service or whatever. And so these priests have been going to England. Obviously, it's incredibly dangerous, but they come in large numbers. So the first 4 priests sent by Allen had arrived in England in 1574, and more had followed over the succeeding years. So by 1579, Allen has around 100 priests kind of working undercover in England, working to keep the flame of Catholicism alive. But now, he's come to Rome to hold this dinner because he wants to turbocharge this mission. And he's come to Rome because he wants the Pope's personal backing for the acceleration of this mission. And 9 days before this dinner, with which we opened the second half, he'd had an interview with the Pope, and the Pope had given the green light, had given his blessing to this great project. And at the same time, Allen is a brilliant networker, very, very skilled in the arts of diplomacy. He's been assiduous in fostering close links with Philip II of Spain, and has actually persuaded him to sponsor an invasion of Ireland. And Elizabeth is the Queen of England and Wales, but she is also the Queen of Ireland. So this is an invasion of her backyard. And that evening at dinner, the dinner being held in Rome in mid-September 1579, Allen gives his fellow guests the great news. The Pope is on board. He's given us more funding. An invasion force with Spanish soldiers has landed in Ireland. It's all great. It's all kicking off. Things are really, really looking up. And Stephen Alford wrote a brilliant book about the kind of the espionage war called The Watchers.
Yeah, The Watchers. Great book.
He describes the speech that Allen gave, that it must have been extraordinary and moving, revealing his persuasive power to inspire and to motivate, which no one ever doubts. I mean, that's why Walsingham sees him as such a dangerous foe. And 6 priests sign up to the mission to England that very evening. And Allen says, you will be going to England in, just a few months at the start of 1580. So that's great. There are those 6 priests, but there is also another priest there who needs no encouragement whatsoever to plan for a mission to England. And this is a guy called Robert Persons, who is in his early 30s. And like you, Dominic, he is a Balliol man. And like you, he is bold, formidable, and charismatic.
Oh, thanks.
Unlike you, however.
Yeah, he's a priest.
He's a priest. He'd been ordained a priest only the year before, and not just any kind of priest, because specifically he had been ordained a priest of the Society of Jesus, so shorthand, a Jesuit.
Right. So tell us a little bit about the Jesuits, because they're about 40 years old at this point, aren't they?
They're a religious order.
Yeah. Poverty, chastity, obedience. But what marks them out is this kind of fanatical loyalty to the Pope, right?
Fanatical devotion to the Pope, I believe, is
right.
the Monty Python would put it. They are the kind of the shock troops who have been formed to combat the Reformation. And their vocation is to win souls for Christ in this last era of a declining and grasping world. And so they've traveled to the limits of the world. They've gone to China. They go to Japan. People who've seen Shogun, the priests in that are Jesuits.
Right.
But Persons, who is English, he thinks, it's great sending priests off to China and Japan, but there's an obvious place where we need to make conversions. And this is my own native land, England. And so he has been pushing for this ever since he's become a Jesuit. So the whole year since his ordination. And his superior, the Jesuit general, is reluctant because he doesn't really want to embroil the order in a mission that will be both very perilous and very controversial. I mean, it really is kind of plunging your hand into the magi mix. But Persons is very, very determined. And so he has joined forces with Alan. And the pair of them have been pushing for this kind of great mission to England. And Alan is very keen. He welcomes Persons with open arms because he kind of admires them as the spiritual elite of the Counter-Reformation, the very sharpest edge. And so over the next few months after this dinner, Alan and Persons refine their plans, and the Pope gives them more funds, and secret documents are drawn up detailing lists of English Catholics who are in exile, and so therefore readily contactable, and who are ready to join the King of Spain in an invasion of England. And the conspirators, when they discuss this plot, they talk very openly because they know that they're among friends, that there are no kind of listeners eavesdropping. They talk openly of the joy that they would feel at seeing, and I quote, the Spaniards, lords of England, and Elizabeth Tudor, Mistress Bess, as they call her, shaked of her estate. And William Allen leaves Rome with this kind of band of priests, this kind of shock force of undercover agents who will be crossing into England. They leave Rome on the 25th of February, 1580. So it is all kicking off.
But there is a particular man with them, isn't there, who listeners might want to pay attention to. And this is a man called Charles Sledd, who has come along as a kind of fixer and a courier for them. And he's a sort of nondescript man. He's literate. He's very effective. He's was once an apprentice to a merchant. He had been in Rome since the previous summer. He had gone to St. Peter's for confession, and then he'd begun working as a servant for an English Catholic churchman in Rome. And how has he got involved? How has he got involved with this party? Why is he with them?
Yeah, so he's in his mid-20s. He's English. He's come to Rome because he's a Catholic, or so he says. And he's taken confession, which demonstrates that he must be a Catholic. And so as an English Catholic, he's looking around for a job, and he gets this job with an English churchman in Rome. And that means that when this English churchman hosts dinners, Charles Sledd is in attendance. And William Allen and Robert Persons are regular attendees at these dinners. And Sledd is there, kind of like a waiter. He's kind of hovering with the wine. No one's paying any attention to him, but of course he can listen to everything that is being said. And Alan does spot him and realizes that he's kind of very able. I mean, he's got all the qualities that you would want in a good servant. And so when Alan heads off with the Jesuits from Rome bound for England, Sledd goes with them and often is riding ahead of them to fix rooms and to take letters for Alan and things like that. So by the 6th of April, before Alan arrives in Paris, Sledd is already there. And then soon afterwards, he's in Reims, which is, of course, home of one of the two seminaries set up by Alan. And then shortly after that, he pops up in Rouen, which is one of the main centres of English Catholic exiles in France. And everywhere he goes, he's carrying letters from Alan, and then he's taking letters back to Alan and the fellow conspirators. And he is attending their meetings. He's laying the table, he's pouring the wine, he's serving the food, and he's listening to their homilies, and he's listening to all the details of their conspiracies. And he's a tremendous fellow to have around. And what a blessing it is for William Allen and the Jesuits and the various priests to have him on hand. And then abruptly in mid-May, Sledd vanishes. And people may be wondering, where has he gone, this trusted servant of William Allen? And I think that the answer to anyone who has read Le Carré will come as no surprise whatsoever, because on the afternoon of 17th of May, he pops up in London at the court in Westminster. And at the court in Westminster, Charles Sledd, if that was indeed his name, is ushered into the presence of Francis Walsingham.
I mean, listeners must have heard this coming when they heard you talking about his eye for detail and he's brilliant master of recall and he can keep a secret and all of this kind of thing. And effectively what he now does is he hands over to Francis Walsingham all the details, all the inside dope on Alan and the Jesuit operation. So he's got lists of names, right? He's got, 300 English Catholic names on this list? These are people on whom Alan said, we can rely, we can contact these people. And Sled just gives all this to Francis Walsingham.
Yeah, so it's details of the pensions they're getting from the Pope and also very, very vivid physical descriptions. And Stephen Alford in The Watchers, which is it's such a brilliant book, so gripping. He describes this list as the most complete reference work then available on Queen Elizabeth's enemies. So it's like downloading a massive database and then uploading it so that you know all your enemy agents that you're up against.
Sort of WikiLeaks type thing.
Yeah, so Robert Beale, so Walsingham's brother-in-law and kind of right-hand man, secretary of the Privy Council, he writes it up and prepares it for distribution to particularly trusted members of the Privy Council. So it's so sensitive that not everybody gets it. And he just titles it Priests and Seminaries Beyond the Seas. You know, this is the key to combating these kind of enemy agents that are coming to England. And this dossier, when Walsingham reads it, and he's got Sled's reports of everything that these priests have been talking about in Rome, where they, Alan was talking about Spanish invasions of Ireland and England and so on. I mean, it just reinforces him in his conviction that England is at war and that the priests that Alan is sending to England might protest that they're not political agents. They are coming to minister to souls. But this is just equivocation. I mean, the Jesuits are notorious for equivocation among Protestants, and this is undoubtedly, I think, how Walsingham sees this kind of talk. Walsingham sees these priests, and the Jesuits perhaps in particular, as just arrant traitors. They're agents of the Pope, but they're also agents of the King of Spain, who is a foreign head of state, and they are conspiring against their anointed queen. So it's treason. So he's going to be targeting them not for their religious beliefs, but as traitors.
Right.
And so this is why Elizabeth is not burning Catholics in the way that her sister had done. She's learnt that lesson. That's bad. If you were up against enemies who are motivated by religious reasons, you don't condemn them for their religious reasons. You condemn them for treason, for being traitors to their anointed queen.
So for Walsingham now, it's a manhunt, right? To track down these conspirators.
Yeah, because he loves hunting. He's not a man who has much time for sport, but the sport he loves is hare coursing, so hunting hares with dogs. But now, yes, basically it's a manhunt.
And he's got two people in particular that he's after. So one of them is the Balliol man you already mentioned, Robert Persons, and the other is Robert Persons' deputy, who is a Londoner called Edmund Campion, who ends up becoming a great hero, doesn't he, to Catholics? Yes.
So he's a very, very impressive man. Almost everything about him is impressive. So unlike William Allen, Campion had initially accepted the Protestant settlement. He'd gone to Oxford, where he'd been the most brilliant student of his day. He had formally welcomed Elizabeth to the university, and Elizabeth had been very impressed with him. So too had William Cecil, who will become Lord Burleigh, and had kind of adopted him as a protege. But Campion starts to have doubts. And in 1569, he leaves Oxford and he goes to Dublin. So it's part of Elizabeth's realms. It is easier to be a Catholic there than it is in England at this point. And he starts to embark on a process of conversion, or maybe reconversion, you should say. And then he ends up in Dowie, which is one of William Allen's two seminaries. And in 1571, he's formally welcomed back into the Catholic Church. And 2 years later, he sets off on foot for Rome, where he becomes a Jesuit. And it's there in 1580 that he is recruited by Persons for the mission to England. And actually, Campion hadn't wanted to go. He agreed with the Jesuit general that this was provocative to send the Jesuits into England. But, he's taken his vow of obedience, so he has to go. And so off he sets. And you might think that if they're going undercover into England, that Persons and Campion would, as they head from Rome towards the Channel, that they'd be doing it in a kind of stealthy manner, a clandestine manner, but not a bit of it. So Campion writes to his superior back in Rome saying that they were being accompanied by something positively like a clamour, because everyone knows they're coming. They're massive celebrities, and their mission is seen by Catholics as something heroic and thrilling. And so despite themselves, they are celebrities even before they have arrived in England.
Reckless.
It is reckless, but maybe also a kind of challenge to the Protestant establishment, that we are coming as priests. And neither Walsingham nor Burghley have any doubt as to particularly Campion's capabilities. You know, we said he's intellectually brilliant. He has this amazing personal magnetism. He's a very warm, charming man. Everybody thinks this. And also this incredible sense of conviction that is total, but not alienating in the way that a kind of fanatical conviction is. So he convinces people without seeming kind of swivel-eyed.
Yeah. He's a true believer, but he's not mad, which is an important distinction. You're not going to recoil from him in the street.
Yeah. So all these qualities, of course, just make him seem more dangerous to Walsingham. And the fact that the Jesuits are coming to England at this specific moment in particular makes them seem sinister. So in Ireland, remember that invasion force that had been sent with the Spanish soldiers? They're still in the field, and they've been swollen by Irish Catholic rebels who have flocked to the banner specifically of the Pope, because an English papal nuncio has landed and is preaching holy war against the heretic Jezebel on the English throne. And so, to quote Jessie Childs in her wonderful prize-winning book, God's Traitors, which is all about the recusants in Elizabethan England, from the government's viewpoint, it looked very much as though Campion and persons were papal Spanish agents bent on subversion, not conversion. The Jesuits say it's about conversion. Walsingham and Burghley say, no, this is subversion.
But they would be right to say that, wouldn't they? I mean, conversion and subversion are the same thing.
If you are a Protestant minister of Queen Elizabeth, indisputably.
Yeah.
If you are a Catholic priest, I think you could say, well, I'm doing God's will.
But it's a fine distinction because the Pope has excommunicated the Queen. I mean, that's surely the killer detail.
You are not wrong, and Campion keeps very quiet about this,
because you cannot possibly say, "Oh, well, this is politically neutral. We're just,
Dominic, you absolutely can, and they do.
They do say that, but people don't believe them.
Well, certainly the Protestant authorities don't believe them, and I suspect quite a lot of the Catholics don't believe them either. But this is what they are saying. So you can see how essentially there is a kind of ideological opposition. And you can see that the question of what is their motivation, is it to convert or is it to subvert, is absolutely what is at stake in this whole episode. Absolutely crucial. So they've arrived in the Channel ports. Now they've got the problem of how do they get over. Persons is the first to make the crossing, and he sets out from Calais to Dover on the 16th of June, 1580. And he has adopted a policy of wildly extravagant disguise. So he's dressed up as a kind of blood and thunder mercenary. He's got a leather coat that's trimmed with gold braid. He's got a feather in his cap, massively flamboyant. I think he's just a natural ham.
It's a good disguise, though.
Yeah, it's a really good disguise because, he's described by a Catholic as being such a peacock, such a swaggerer. And so no one thinks for a minute that he could possibly be a priest. And so he crosses with no problem at all. Then Campion follows a week later, and he's disguised himself as a jeweller from Dublin because, of course, he'd spent time in Dublin, so he's familiar with it. And he gets stopped because he resembles William Allen's brother, who had been on Sled's list that he'd handed over to Walsingham. And so he does get apprehended, and for reasons that aren't entirely clear, they don't keep him. So he manages to carry on from Dover, and he arrives in London, where he rendezvous with Persons, and Persons and Campion for the next few weeks are then touring safe houses across the capital, and they're preaching and they're celebrating Mass and they're hosting conferences with leading English Catholics who are overjoyed to have these two very charismatic figures directly from the Pope in London. And Campion, he understands, Dominic, where Walsingham and you are coming from. He knows that he is being accused of treason. And so he writes a formal letter explicitly denying this charge and insisting that he's come only, and I quote, to preach the gospel, to minister the sacraments, to instruct the simple, to reform sinners, to confute errors. And his instructions to his fellow Catholics are, should I be captured, then send this letter to the Privy Council so that they can read and see what my motivation is. The problem with this is that it's a brilliantly well-written letter. I mean, everything Campion does is brilliant. And so Catholics read it and they go, oh, this is great. We should share it. And so they start copying it. And so inevitably it falls into the hands of Walsingham's agents. To English Catholics, this letter is a great rallying cry. They find it very moving and inspirational. But to Walsingham and to the Protestant authorities more generally, this letter is not reassuring in the slightest. It seems a really terrifying provocation. And you can see why. So this is also what Campion has written. The expense is reckoned, the enterprise is begun, it is of God, it cannot be withstood. So the faith was planted, so it must be restored. And how do you restore it? You restore it by getting rid of the Protestant Jezebel and planting the Catholic Queen of Scots on the throne. And so unsurprisingly, among Protestants, the letter is very soon notorious and they call it Campion's brag.
Do you think that's unfair? Do you think, I mean, he's not saying anything, just reading it. I mean, of course, there's a sort of, you might say there's kind of ideological arrogance to it. You know, we
he's
are
a Jesuit.
Yeah. But I mean,
ideological arrogance is the whole point of being, I suppose, a kind of, you know, a part of a religious shock force.
But I'm surprised that they're so provoked by it.
I think it's because he was one of their own. He's writing in the style of an Oxford-educated Protestant, but he's turning their weapons against them. I mean, again, you know, to draw the analogy with the Cambridge traitors, that's what's kind of shocking to the British establishment, was that chaps who'd been to decent colleges and belonged to clubs in St. James's had been working for the communists. And so I think there's an element of that this is a very, very well-written letter. And they know that Campion is unbelievably smart, and therefore they can read between the lines. They know what he's getting at.
And you compared him with the Cambridge traitors. I mean, he acquires this sort of, I don't know, Kim Philby style reputation, doesn't he? As a man who is, there's a kind of charisma to a sort of, you know, that fascinates his enemies as much as his adherents.
I mean, Kim Philby is an evil man who betrayed lots of people to their deaths. Campion is not doing that. Campion is a very brave, committed, heroic man, I think, who absolutely believes what he's doing.
But he has a similar grip on the imagination that somebody like Philby had.
I mean, if you're saying he's very charismatic, then yes. But he becomes a hero to Catholics because they see him, which I think he is, as a principled and heroic man who is touring. You know, he leaves London, he tours Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire, so the countryside. He's preaching in barns and he's attracting ever swelling congregations. You know, he has a touch of the stardust. People want to come and hear him. And undoubtedly, you know, he is getting converts. He's offering reassurance to Catholics who've been oppressed for a decade and a half now. And of course, he's always on the move. He's always having to put on disguises which Campion himself regards as ridiculous. But, you know, for months and months, he's not caught, and the whole Protestant spy agency are looking out for him. So that also adds to his kind of glamour, I think, the sense of him as, as a kind of secret agent as well as a priest. And then on the 27th of June, 1581, so by this point, he's been there, you know, almost a year. He throws down a very dramatic gauntlet by having an open challenge to the Queen printed and distributed across Oxford. And again, he is kind of tweaking the nose of the Protestant establishment. So he writes in this pamphlet, "Listen, Elizabeth, mighty Queen, the prophet in speaking to thee is teaching thee thy duty." That is bound to seem provocative, I think,
of course,
to people like Walsingham. And so Walsingham says, come on, this is going beyond a joke. We have to get this guy. And it's clear by now that he is starting to kind of leave a trail. And he's captured 3 weeks later on the 17th of July at a recusant's house called Lifford Grange in Berkshire. And actually, the people who are coming to who find him were not specifically looking for him. They were looking for other priests. But he is found after a 2-day search, hiding in a priest hole with these 2 other priests. And the guy who has led them there is a very sinister figure called George Eliot. So he's the spy catcher, and he's a Catholic apostate who, as is the way so often with apostates, he's keen to prove himself more Protestant than the Protestants. And he has been playing on the Privy Council's paranoia. He's been really bigging up all the stuff about plots and things funded by the Pope, assassinations of Elizabeth. I think coming up with material that wasn't actually true. And he very shrewdly tells Burleigh and Walsingham that they're in line to be murdered as well. So that kind of adds to their sense of urgency in trying to find these priests. And so when Campion is brought out from the priest hole, he is not treated well, which is what you would expect. So his elbows are tied behind him. He's plonked on a horse. A sign is pinned to his hat, which reads Campion, the seditious Jesuit. And he is led straight to the Tower of London, where he is locked up in this hideous cell called Little Ease, which is a joke because you can neither stretch nor rise to your feet. So he spends 3 days there. It must have been agony. But Little Ease is not to be the worst because the rack is waiting. And people may be wondering, well, what's the status of torture in England at this time? Torture is illegal. But at the same time, Walsingham is convinced that it has to be applied. So he had written to Burleigh in 1575, without torture, I know we shall not prevail.
Golly, very War on Terror.
Kind of Dick Cheney, isn't it? What was it? Enhanced interrogation techniques. Yeah. It's a no-brainer. So I think for Walsingham, it's a no-brainer. So Campion in his brag, that letter he'd written that was meant to be private, but which had gone viral, he had declared his defiance of Elizabeth's judicial authorities by directly name-checking the prospect of torture. So he'd said, while we have a man left to enjoy your Tyburn, where people are hanged, or to be racked with torments, or to be consumed with your prisons, we will keep coming. And he was right to dread what the Protestant authorities would do, because in the Tower he is repeatedly racked, and it's so brutal that he loses the use of his pen hand. So people may remember that Guy Fawkes, you can look at his signature before and after he's been racked. Campion has it so badly that he can't even sign a paper. And when he's not being tortured, he's being subjected to various inquiries. So there's a judicial inquiry led by Robert Beale. There's a big theological debate, which is staged in the parish church of the Tower. And Campion is only allowed the Bible, so he's not allowed any other books, no other reference books. And then there's a public trial is staged in Westminster Hall in November 1581. And throughout all these processes, the core argument is the one that we were talking about earlier. Is his mission a pastoral one, or is it blatant treason? And this is, they just keep going over and over and over it. And there's never really any doubt as to what the verdict is going to be. So on the 20th of November, Campion is convicted not of heresy, not of any crime of conscience, but as an offender against a statute against treason that had been passed in the reign of Edward III 220 years before. So he is convicted as a traitor.
Yeah. And
on the 1st of December, he suffers the death of a traitor. So he is lashed onto a hurdle. He is taken from his prison to Tyburn, which is now Marble Arch in London, but was the traditional place for executions. And there he suffers the hideous, hideous death of a traitor. So he's hanged until he is almost dead. He's then cut down. He is still alive as his bowels and his genitals are cut off and pulled out and burnt in front of him. And then when he's dead, his body is quartered and the various quarters are dispatched to gateways around London. And Walsingham and Burleigh and the Privy Council take a very, very grim satisfaction in Campion's fate, because it draws what seems to be a line under what had been a very grim year. So first, that rebellion in Ireland, we talked about the Spanish troops, the papal nuncio, that has been suppressed. It took place at a place called Smerwick in County Kerry, and all the Spanish troops had been satisfyingly massacred. And now the most dangerous papist agent that has been sent to England under Elizabeth has been captured, convicted, and killed. And of course, Persons is still on the scene, but he manages to to slip away, and the flow of priests does continue into the country for the rest of Elizabeth's reign. But I think that Walsingham and his men now feel that they have the measure of what is going on. And over the course of Elizabeth's reign, 471 priests will end up being captured, and 116 of these will be executed. And the reason that the numbers are so high is because neither side is willing to abandon its respective strategy. Because both sides, I think, feel that the benefits they secure from what they're doing outweighs the costs. So for Walsingham's men, they are stopping the proselytization of potential Catholics. It's destroying a foreign-funded campaign of subversion.
Yeah.
For the Catholic priests, their deaths enshrines them as martyrs and gives them what Protestants had been given under Mary Tudor. So to this day, Edmund Campion and a lot of the Catholic priests who were executed under Elizabeth, they're saints. They kind of give their names to rooms in Catholic schools and things like that. But the consequence for the climate in Elizabethan England is undoubtedly to generate a sense of paranoia, as you always do when there's a kind of espionage war going on. And because this is a specifically Christian espionage war, it gives people on both sides, Catholics and Protestants, a sense that they're living in the shadow of a kind of great cosmic drama.
But a drama that's not just playing out in the shadows, Tom. It's not just a story about spies and back rooms and priest holes and double agents, is it? It's also a story of swashbuckling sea dogs.
It is, right?
And that's what we'll be turning to next time. So in the next episode, from the coast of California to the Straits of Magellan, we will be venturing onto the marine front in the ideological struggle between Protestantism and Catholicism. And in particular, we will be heading onto the Pacific Ocean with one of the greatest figures of the Elizabethan age, not uncontroversial figure these days, and that is Sir Francis Drake. So loads of excitement, loads of rough action, loads of swashbuckling swordplay to come next time. Now, if you remember the Rest is History Club, you may well be on the Pacific Ocean as we speak. You may have not even be listening to this because you may be already listening to that episode right now, because you can, of course, because you get all the episodes early. If you're not a member of the Rest is History Club and you'd like to be part of our own shadowy cabal of sinister conspirators, then you just need to head to therestishistory.com to sign up. And of course, that's the only way you'll get the host of unbelievable benefits. And there are other ways to sign up, but only through the website, therestishistory.com, do you get the cornucopia of delights that we offer our members. And of course, the other thing you can do is to sign up to our free newsletter. And there you get all kinds of absolutely riveting articles, interviews, book extracts, and more. So on that bombshell, we'll be back next time with Sir Francis Drake. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.